Bibliophiles of the internet, my name is Adriana and today I'm here to finally bring you my June wrap-up. I knew going into June that it would be an extremely busy month, what with finals, my thesis project, graduation, life, so on and so forth, so I kind of wanted to go a bit easy on myself and I settled on the theme of Join in June. The idea behind Join in June was that I knew I'd have my hands full helping to co-host Tome Topple for 2 weeks out of the month, and indeed a majority of my reading came from there. But also because June was Pride Month and I thought I could squeeze in a few queer books at the end of the month after Tome Topple was over. That didn't actually end up happening. I only read one, but it was a really good one, and I saw that as still joining in on the wonderful and much needed celebration of the queer community, especially after everything that happened in Orlando. So anyways, that was my mindset. That's enough chit chat, let's just get into it. The first 4 books I read in June I either completed or started during Tome Topple, which was a great success. The first tome I toppled was The Secret History by Donna Tartt. This is like a literary mystery thriller. It's about a guy named Richard who decides to attend this elite university in New England, and when he gets there he wants to study classics. But the major is kind of constrained in the sense that there's only 5 students currently enrolled as classics majors, and not only does Richard have to impress and gain acceptance from the one classics professor on campus, but if he does this he has to kind of forsake the entire university system to take all of his classes through this one professor with these 5 other students, which is not a thing that most people want to do. Richard does eventually gain access to this elite group of students, but shortly afterwards he realizes that the world he's chosen for himself has suddenly become very small. These people know each other very well, very intimately. They know each other's deepest, darkest secrets. To his dismay, the further he gets involved with this group, the more he realizes these people are governed by completely different laws. They have done unthinkable things in the past, and they will continue to do unthinkable things in the future if it means keeping those secrets in the past. Looking back on it, I think this story is extremely odd, but because of the way it's written, it's also captivating and fascinating. It's this strange, self-contained little world that operates on its own rules, and it's crazy, but it's just crazy enough to get you to suspend your belief for the duration of the story. But then once you step back from it, you kind of think, what did I just read? But I also think part of that is because a lot of the characters in this story are excessively, ridiculously, filthy rich, so they kind of live in their own world that has very different rules that frankly I will never understand. So it's also kind of a glimpse into extreme excess amounts of privilege and questions what kind of things would take over your life if money and work were no object. The only character who isn't wealthy or privileged is Richard, and I think that's really important because he acts as the reader's lens into this story and allows us as readers access into this crazy group as well. But the characters surrounding him are just fascinating because they don't just study classics, they live classics. They're completely consumed by theory, philosophy, ancient laws and belief systems and ethics, and they're almost trying to recreate and reinstate these ancient beliefs and ideals in the modern world, which is just such a strange and interesting disruption that it makes for a really compelling story. The story also talks a lot about the human relationship with the self, separation from the self, avoidance of the self, escape from the self, if that's even possible, and if so, what are the consequences of that, and what will we find there? So it just gave me a lot to think about. It's a very strange story, the events of which could probably never be replicated in real life with any kind of success, but then again, I don't think that's the marker of what makes a story believable or real. I do think this story is in its own way believable, especially because the characters are painted with such vibrancy and clarity, and because the prose has such a clear intent. So I don't know what to say. I think the book is somewhat overly long, and I found the narrative repeating itself from time to time, so I do think the pacing could have been a little bit tighter, but overall I really like this book and I enjoyed the time that I spent with this story, and I have a feeling I'm going to be thinking about it for a very long time to come, so I gave it 4 stars. The next tome I toppled was The Unexpected Everything by Morgan Matson. This story is about a girl named Andy who has a very productive professional summer planned out ahead of her. Everything's perfect, but that's before her father, who is a politician, gets mixed up in some kind of a scandal. So suddenly her summer is looking very different and she's struggling to figure out what to do next. I find myself not really wanting to talk about this book because honestly, and no pun intended, but I expected more from Morgan Matson, and she's kind of been slipping in these last 2 books, and so I don't really know how to feel. In my opinion, this book is very middle of the road, not very memorable, kind of meh, and I can't for the life of me figure out why this book was over 500 pages either, because reflecting back on it, I don't feel like much was accomplished during that time, and I don't feel like all that space was used as effectively as it could have been to drive the story. So I don't know, it just wasn't her best. Like, I feel like you can read the synopsis of this book and just predict all the turns it's gonna take and all the places it's gonna go, and then you read it and it just does all those things that you expected. Again, didn't intend to make that pun, but it happened. So it's just not exciting to read. But honestly, predictability isn't even the kiss of death in books anymore. Like, it doesn't have to be a deal breaker. I just also felt like the characters and the story were somewhat bland. I felt like it fell into a lot of rom-com cliches. And also there were times when I questioned whether or not Morgan Matson was maybe a little bit overly conscious of her readership, because I could definitely see her pulling the strings. There were things that happened in this book where I questioned whether these events were necessary for the story or true to the characters, or whether or not she was just following a formula or doing things that she thought her readers would like to see or what they would expect from her. Don't get me wrong, I do think it was a cute, heartwarming story at times. It had some really good moments, and overall I thought it was enjoyable. I just don't think it's anything special, and I don't think it's gonna go back on my shelf either. I gave it 3 stars. After that, for my graphic novel break, I read volume 1 of Behind the Scenes by Bisco Hattori. I actually did a Manga Monday video for this series where I describe the series, review it, and also put it in conversation with Ouran High School Host Club. I'm kind of ridiculously proud of that video, and if you have not seen it yet, I will link it down below. Bottom line is, I love, love, love this series, and I'm very excited for its continuation. I gave this first volume 5 stars. Then the last tome I partially toppled during the readathon but then finished afterwards was A Gathering of Shadows by B.E. Schwab. Even though this book definitely had its problems, I still really enjoyed it, and I feel like it did all the things a good sequel should set out to do. It further complicated the world and the story. It built upon the tension that was established in book 1, all while bringing me a greater understanding of and appreciation for the main characters, especially Kel. I really, really like Kel. My biggest issue with this story is definitely pacing, because it felt really off to me. It takes a long time for this book to gather steam, and it's over 500 pages as well. It's kind of slowly building towards that big magical competition, and there's a lot of hype surrounding that. But then it's actually not all that important, but it is around that time when things start happening and things start getting really interesting, and then afterwards it has one of those trademark V.E. Schwab shit hits the fan kind of endings. So I kind of wish the strength of that final act was present throughout this entire book, but it wasn't. But like I said, I do think this book did a great job of further complicating the series while also bringing a lot of new depth and texture to the main characters in a really great way. And I also really enjoy reading about the atmosphere surrounding this world as well. I just had a lot of minor issues with the story. So if I'm being honest, I think it's sitting somewhere around a 3.5 stars. Then I finally finished what would be my favorite book of the month by far, of course, and that was The Girl Who Fell Beneath Fairyland and Led the Revels There by Catherine M. Valente. I love that this series is grounded in a completely nonsense fantasy world, but at the same time it feels so real and so believable, because even though every character that September encounters and every quest that she takes on is in its own way ridiculous and funny, it's also whimsical, thoughtful, charming, and it also reflects some very real aspect of the world around us. So even though this story is definitely very highly fantastical, it's still a fantastic mirror of the world around us. And I just love that you can tell that all the choices September has to make and all the consequences that she faces because of those choices carry real weight. I love that you get to be there with her as she slowly grows up, changes, learns new things, challenges the world around her, learns who she really is. And I felt like this book somehow was even more raw and had more depth to it than book 1, which I didn't think could even be done. This series really is the perfect balance between whimsy and melancholy. It's so thought-provoking and it has so much texture and depth, and I think that's definitely my favorite part about it. And every time I read one of her books, I just marvel at Catherine M. Valente, at her talent, her imagination, the beauty of her mind, and I just get this weird feeling every time I read her work, like it had to come out of her mind just like this, fully formed and perfectly written, not needing any kind of revision or changes, just one draft and done. And I know that's not true at all, but I feel like that's the mark of a great writer, that I can't even imagine this story or her other stories existing in any other form but this. I don't have words, only love for this series, and I gave this second book 5 stars. And finally, the last book I read in June was Every Heart a Doorway by Seanan McGuire. Before I say anything else, this book is queerlit and it's amazing. It has a canon on the page, self-identified, self-proclaimed, asexual main character. It's great representation and so important. This is a fantastical story about this sanatorium for wayward children, which takes in kids who have somehow fallen through portals into other worlds, and then for whatever reason they've come back again. So it's there to help them cope with readjusting to the real world. I went into this book for the ace rep, not really knowing what to expect from the story itself, besides hoping that the prose was as stunning as everyone said, and it was. But it really took me by surprise, and it turned into like this surprise murder mystery, which I'm always here for, so that was really fun to read about, but just the concept itself was done so well. It was fascinating to read Seanan McGuire's take on these fantasy worlds, because the more you learn about the fantasy worlds, the more you learn about the characters themselves. No two fantasy worlds are the same, and they each take a specific child for a specific reason, and they encompass everything that child is. They manifest themselves and the child's desires and needs in a completely unique way. So the ejection from those worlds is a kind of trauma, because each character finds themselves in these worlds. They find meaning, they find a home, and then that world rejects them and wants nothing to do with them. So to see how these characters are coping or not coping, readjusting to the world around them, or to see how their experiences in these worlds have so strongly affected how they perceive the real world and how they differentiate between what's real and what's not, is just utterly compelling to read about. This story was just so creative, so heart-wrenching, well thought out, well written, and just overall I thought it was amazing, so I gave it 4.5 stars. So those are all the books I read in June. Of course, I would love to hear from you if you have any thoughts to share on the books I mentioned today, or you can feel free to let me know what is the best book that you've read in recent memory. But that is everything I had for this video today. Thank you so much for watching. I really hope that you enjoyed it, and I will catch you on the flip side of the page. Bye!